The battle for Ukraine's eastern Donbass region rages on, and Russia is tightening its grip on the key city of Sievierodonetsk. Russian troops now control up to 80% of the city and are urging Ukrainian forces to surrender. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine is outgunned in one of the bloodiest battles of the war and has pleaded with Western allies to send more long-range weapons. He described the human cost of the fighting as simply terrifying.
Bridges destroyed. The city of Sievierodonetsk is now almost cut off. Authorities say they're still able to evacuate the wounded, but the situation for those still left is worsening, and fast. Street battles are raging in the eastern city. The governor of the region says it's mostly under Russian control. Much of Sievierodonetsk has been destroyed. Authorities believe more than 500 civilians, including children, are sheltering at the vast Azot chemical plant. They say the plant is under heavy bombardment from Russian forces. Moscow and pro-Russian separatists in the region have issued an ultimatum to the Ukrainian troops still holding out in the city.
The Ukrainian military units that are stationed there remain there forever. They have two options: either follow the example of their colleagues and surrender, or die. They have no other option.
But the Ukrainian president remains defiant.
We are dealing with absolute evil, and we have no other choice but to move forward, free our entire territory, kick the occupiers out of all our regions. And although now the width of our front is already more than 2,500 kilometres, you can feel that the strategic initiative is still on our side.
In Provilia, a nearby town to the northwest of Sievierodonetsk, Ukrainian police race to bring civilians to safety. Many of them elderly. They didn't want to leave their homes. Now they have no choice but to go.
DW correspondent Emmanuel Chaz is in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Emma, we understand that Russia wants to establish a so-called humanitarian corridor on Wednesday to evacuate those civilians who are trapped in that chemical plant in Sievierodonetsk. What more have you learned about that?
Well, indeed, it was an announcement made earlier today by the Russian Ministry of Defense that they were ready to evacuate the civilians who are trapped in that chemical plant. So it's the Azot chemical plant in Sievierodonetsk. But as we've just heard in the report, there were also those separatists who were saying that Ukrainian soldiers only had the choice to surrender or to die. Now, this might remind you of a situation we know very well, sadly, now is that of Mariupol, where there were Ukrainian forces trapped along with civilians in a steel plant, this time in Mariupol. And now we're in that situation where civilians direly need to be evacuated from Sievierodonetsk, but under which conditions will that depend on soldiers' surrenders? This is not quite clear yet. What we know tonight is that Sievierodonetsk is completely cut off from the rest of Ukrainian forces. The 3 bridges of the city has been destroyed, and up to 80% of the city is now under Russian control.
Indeed, Emma, the Ukrainian president described the situation as very dire. And again, he's urging allies to send more heavy weapons and ammunition. What exactly do we know about the state of the Ukrainian forces?
Well, what we know is rather what the Ukrainian forces do not have to fight, and that's heavy weapons. And President Volodymyr Zelenskyy really criticized the Western allies for being too restrained in their decision-making. And what is a matter of diplomacy for Western power is a matter of life and death for Ukrainians here on the ground who are paying with the price of blood. We've had some figures for the Ministry of Defense here in Ukraine of up to 100 soldiers dying, Ukrainian Ukrainian soldiers dying every day since the beginning of the war. And we even had the presidential advisor who gave a list of things that were needed by the Ukrainian army, a quite straightforward list that was published on Twitter, with 500 tanks, 2,000 armored vehicles, 1,000 drones, just to give you an idea as to how desperate Ukraine is now to receive the weapons promised by the West.
DW correspondent Emmanuel Chaz reporting from Kyiv, Ukraine. Emma, thank you.
Ambassador Chensov, why is it so important for Ukraine to be granted candidate status into the EU right now?
Hello, thank you for your question. It is really important to get it now because it's an existential challenge for Ukraine to sustain the pressure to keep fighting with Russia, which is invading Ukraine. And for us, this green light, this yes from the European Union, it's something which gives a hope to Ukrainian people, which boosts morale to Ukrainian army, and it gives the direction of development of the country for the mid and long-term future.
You're talking about development of the country. There are some EU member states who are more hesitant on the issue of candidate status because they say that reforms in Ukraine are not happening fast enough. Judicial reform, rule of law reform, anti-corruption reform. What is it that you can offer such member states? What is it that Ukraine can do now to show its commitment to these reforms?
I would like to offer a few things to those member states. First of all, to be fair with Ukraine and to look in which state the countries which exceeded or got the membership candidate status back in the 90s or later, in which state of development, in which state their justice system or anti-corruption system were on that moment. And I mean that Ukraine is much more advanced now than those countries were some 20 years ago.
So you're basically saying that this wouldn't be an exception for Ukraine, that Ukraine is actually in a better position than many other countries who've been granted candidate status have been?
No, to the contrary, because Ukraine, for a time being, already implemented about 60-70% of the EU acquis in the different fields. Why? Because association agreement, which was negotiated and signed with the EU, is a very complex agreement. And what European Union did, definitely they used the accession experience and presented Ukraine the same, let's say, more or less the same instrument, the same approach, but without clear membership perspective then. Now, what EU has to do is really to compensate, to give this membership the candidate status, and to make a fair answer to Ukraine.
Having said that, Georgia and Moldova are also taking this opportunity to apply for the same thing. Do you feel that this somehow reduces Ukraine's chances? Is this somehow some kind of a competing for this candidate status that perhaps takes away from Ukraine's chances at a time when you're saying it's really urgent for Ukraine?
Look, we are definitely not competing, neither with Moldova nor with Georgia. They have the right to apply to the European Union membership. What we are talking about exceptional situation, an exceptional case of Ukraine. And this is something which differs us.
What happens if Ukraine doesn't get candidate status? What will Ukraine do?
Ukraine will get candidate status. And we do not see the plan B in this situation because we deserve it, because this is a historic and crucial moment for the EU to give the right answer.
This is obviously still under wraps to a large extent, but we hear that the leaders of France, Germany and Italy, that is Chancellor Olaf Scholz, President Emmanuel Macron and President Mario Draghi, will be in Kiev talking to President Zelenskyy. What would Kiev like to see from these leaders? What should they be taking to such a meeting?
It's first of all, it's very good news that they're coming to Ukraine to see their own eyes what is going on and how they can support Ukraine, and also to see what is the level of reform, what is the level of maturity of Ukraine in the context of this membership perspective, and definitely how to help Ukraine militarily. So this is something they need to do now, and they need to do fast.
Finally, Ambassador, EU heads of state will be meeting again at the end of this month. Can we expect that President Zelenskyy would be addressing that meeting?
So it depends on the format and the program of the meeting, and President Zelenskyy already several times addressed the Council. So it's definitely for the President of the Council, for the Member State to decide how to do it this time.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time, Ambassador. Thank you very much.